They laughed at the cowboy with the stethoscope. In a dusty barn turned infirmary on the outskirts of a Texas POW ranch, a young Japanese woman snorted at the sight before her. An American rancher, broad-shouldered, sunburned, still wearing spurs, was checking her blood pressure with a trembling hand. His hat was off, but his holster was still on. Another prisoner whispered something in Japanese, and the rest giggled. "Do they treat wounds with whiskey, too?" one said. They had been taught that Americans were crude, unsanitary, little more than brutes in boots. But when another woman collapsed during roll call the next morning, pale, feverish, barely breathing, it wasn't the nurses who came running. It was the cowboys. And trailing behind them, a team of medics with clean instruments, steady voices, and hands that moved with unflinching purpose. What followed in that barn would rewrite everything the women thought they knew about the barbaric West. The laughter stopped, and in its place came a silence filled with awe and something dangerously close to gratitude. The first time they saw him, he was leaning against the porch rail with a clipboard in one hand and a stethoscope slung around his neck like a prop in a school play. His boots were caked in red dust, and his hat cast a long shadow across his face. The girls stared from the back of the truck, their expressions locked somewhere between confusion and disbelief. One of them snorted. "That's the doctor?" she whispered in Japanese. Another giggled and added, "Maybe he'll check our hearts with a horseshoe." Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies like discarded husks. Months of hunger had shrunk them down to bones and discipline, but not even starvation could strip them of the one thing they still clung to, the belief that the enemy was a joke. The cowboy, his name was Curtis, didn't look like a doctor, not by Japanese standards. There was no white coat, no clipboard filled with test results, no sterile gloves, just denim, sunburn, and an awkward smile as he motioned them toward the barn turned infirmary. Another man joined him, a lanky Texan named Miller, whose only nod to medical training seemed to be the dog-eared Red Cross manual tucked into his back pocket. The POWs exchanged glances. A few rolled their eyes. "This is how they treat wounded?" one muttered under her breath. "We're better off with bandages made of rice paper." The others chuckled, too tired to keep their sarcasm sharp. Inside the barn, the scene didn't help. A table had been cleared of tools and stacked with gauze, iodine, and neatly folded towels, but the air still smelled of livestock and hay. A cot sagged beneath a lumpy mattress. Nearby, a basin steamed faintly, though no one could quite tell if it was for washing hands or feeding pigs. One of the women, Shiori, squinted at the equipment and shook her head. "They boil their instruments in stew pots," she whispered, and the women behind her bit their tongues to keep from laughing. They weren't trying to be cruel, not really. They were trying to make sense of a world that had upended every expectation. They had been told Americans were animals, that they would beat them, humiliate them, toss them into cages. Instead, they were being guided gently toward checkups by men who tipped their hats and said, "Ma'am," like they were greeting dinner guests. It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was terrifying. Because beneath the ridicule, something else stirred. Midori, the one with the sharpest tongue and the quietest eyes, felt it first. As the cowboy named Curtis wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm, she flinched not from pain, but from gentleness. He said something softly, something she didn't understand, and gave her a look that wasn't pity, but concern. She stared at his hands. They were rough, cracked from work, but steady, no leering, no force. Just a slow twist of the bulb, the faint squeeze of pressure, and then release. The other women watched from the side, arms crossed, faces blank, but their posture betrayed them, shoulders slumped from more than exhaustion. Eyes darted toward Curtis's every move, cataloging each unexpected kindness, every gesture that clashed with the stories they had been fed since girlhood. They whispered behind his back, half snickering, half searching. "He looks like he should be milking cows, not treating wounds. Maybe he'll use whiskey as antiseptic. What if he's never even seen a real hospital?" But the words came slower now, less edge, more wonder. The jokes, once sharp as bayonets, began to dull, because hidden under all the scoffing was a reality none of them wanted to admit. They were tired, not just from the journey or the hunger, but from the weight of certainty. Certainty that the world was one way, that Americans were savages, and that surrender meant annihilation. But these men, awkward, sunburned, earnest, did not fit into that script. And when the checkups ended, when the doctors stepped back and offered them water, blankets, even a moment to rest, the women didn't know whether to laugh again or listen. Midori sat on the edge of the cot, her sleeve rolled up, the faint imprint of the cuff still on her arm. She looked down at it, then across the barn. Curtis was talking to Miller, scribbling something in his notebook, probably about blood pressure or fever or whatever he thought he was tracking. She watched him for a long time, her head tilted like someone trying to understand a riddle written in a foreign tongue. Then she said, softly, "He doesn't know what he's doing." She paused. "But I think he's trying." No one laughed. The thought had barely finished forming in Midori's mind when her vision dimmed at the edges, the sun above blurring into a white smear across the sky. Her knees gave way, sudden as a trapdoor, and she dropped to the dirt like a string-cut puppet. Dust billowed around her. Someone shouted, boots thundered closer, but Midori didn't hear the words. She was somewhere else now, somewhere much farther from Texas. In Nagoya, the air always smelled like antiseptic and ash. Midori was 17 when the conscription orders came. She was too thin to carry a rifle and too quiet to be trusted with radio equipment. So they gave her a different assignment. Teishintai, a nurse's assistant. The word sounded noble, even graceful. But there was no grace in scraping dried blood off bedpans or folding sheets stiff with fever sweat. Her fingers cracked from washing linens with lye. She learned to recognize death an hour before it came, by the hollowness in a boy's voice or the way his toes stopped twitching. There were no morphine drips, no sterile gloves, no doctors after sundown, just women with cloths and whispers and eyes that stopped blinking. Midori stopped blinking too. The field hospital was little more than a cement box with tar paper windows and a leaky roof. Supplies were rationed tighter than rice. Gauze was reused. Syringes were shared. The most common tool wasn't a scalpel, it was a prayer. The patients, many just a few years older than her, sometimes cried for their mothers, but more often they just asked, "Will I go home?" Midori lied to all of them. She was good at it. She had to be. She had once held the hand of a boy with half his ribs blown out and whispered, "You'll be fine," as he drowned in his own blood. When it ended, she wiped his face and folded the blanket over his chest like nothing had happened. The officers told her she was strong, but that wasn't strength. That was survival. They taught her other things too, lessons wrapped in certainty. They said Western medicine was crude. American doctors were butchers in white coats who used drugs to hide pain instead of conquering it. "Their bodies are stronger," one instructor said, "but their souls are weak. They scoffed at penicillin and antiseptics. They treat fevers like headaches," someone muttered during a training session. "They don't understand suffering." In their lectures, Japanese medicine was sacred. American care was mechanical, soulless, transactional. The idea became gospel, and Midori believed it. Or at least, she wanted to. But that was before her legs gave out in the dust of Texas. The sun still burned above her, and now she was back in the present, back in her body, back under foreign skies. Rough hands gripped her shoulders. She flinched, but they didn't strike. Instead, they steadied her, lifted her. Curtis's voice floated above her, urgent but careful. Get her inside. The world tilted. Shadows moved. Then came the jostle of motion, the creak of wood, the smell of hay and iodine. She was inside the barn. A damp cloth pressed against her forehead. Someone murmured, "She's burning up." And then, absurdly, a familiar word cut through the fog. Pulse. Measured. Calm. American. Midori's eyes fluttered open. She was lying on a cot. A fan turned lazily overhead. Curtis was holding her wrist. Another man was checking her temperature. She felt the pinch of something at her arm, a cuff, and the brush of gauze at her temple. The tools weren't crude. They were precise, new, clean. This wasn't what she had been told. The room was quiet, save for the occasional scribble on a notepad or the creak of boots on the floorboards. There was no mockery, no smirking, just work, focused and unrelenting. The enemy, it turned out, had good hands. Outside, the ranch seemed impossibly calm. Chickens clucked near the fence. The smell of bacon drifted from the mess hall. And somewhere, a harmonica played a tune she didn't know. No cages. No screaming, just absurd normalcy. Midori turned her head slowly, her mouth dry, her mind racing. She remembered the leaflets they used to burn, the ones dropped by American planes. You will be treated fairly. You will be fed. Do not fear surrender. She had laughed at them once. Everyone had. Lies, they said. Psychological tricks. But now, her body wrapped in clean sheets and her fever breaking under the hum of a fan, Midori wasn't laughing. She was alive. And the cowboy was still holding her hand. Midori woke with her lips cracked and her tongue thick against her teeth. The ceiling above her was made of pine planks, their knots swirling like eyes that never blinked. A breeze whispered through the cracks, carrying the scent of hay and soap clean, almost sweet. She turned her head and groaned. The motion sent a spike of nausea through her ribs. Her vision blurred. Someone was speaking softly nearby. Not Japanese. A man's voice, deep and low, saying something she couldn't understand. A doctor leaned over her. Not a cowboy this time. His sleeves were rolled, his shirt spotless. His hands were large, but precise, like they belonged to someone who fixed delicate machinery. He held a syringe in one hand and a tube in the other, and when he saw her eyes flicker open, he paused, gave her a small nod, not commanding, not cold, just permission. She flinched anyway. In her world, sharp things always came with pain. Injections were fast and brutal, given by overworked orderlies with no time to speak. But this doctor didn't rush. He placed the back of his hand on her forehead, murmured something to the man beside him, and then turned back with a sterile alcohol wipe. Midori braced, for it tightened her muscles, prepared for the sting. It never came. The needle slid into her arm with such care that she barely felt it. The sensation was foreign, almost insulting. Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from something else, something deeper. Her eyes stung, and to her horror, tears rose. She blinked rapidly, angry at herself. She wasn't crying from pain. She was crying because it didn't hurt. The doctor secured the IV and adjusted the flow. A coolness spread through her arm. Another man appeared Japanese, or close enough. A Nisei, perhaps. Second generation. His accent was clumsy, but the words reached her. "You are very ill," he said. "Fever. Infection. We will help." She stared at him. confused. No threats, no condescension. He even bowed, slightly, as if she were still someone worth showing respect to. This wasn't just kindness. It was competence. It was science without cruelty. The room didn't smell of rot or bleach, it smelled of purpose. Gauze was stacked in neat rows. A thermometer lay in a silver tray, not crusted with blood or shared between patients. A chart hung at the end of the cot with her name, her real name, written in careful block letters. Midori had never seen anything like it. The whispers among the women had been wrong. These weren't cowboys pretending to be doctors. These were doctors, real ones, professionals, trained hands, not just big ones. And for the first time, Midori felt the war shift, not in the maps or headlines, but inside her chest. It was a quiet collapse, the kind that doesn't make noise until long after it starts. She let her head sink back into the pillow. The IV line tugged gently at her skin, reminding her of its presence. A nurse appeared beside her and dabbed her lips with a wet cloth. The translator stood nearby. "Do you need anything?" he asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The idea of asking the enemy for help was still too tangled with shame. But her silence wasn't defiance anymore. It was surrender of a different kind. She watched as the nurse smoothed the blanket over her legs. No one mocked her weight, her pallor, her weakness. No one asked her why she had fallen. They already knew. They had seen it before. They treated her like she mattered, like saving her was normal, not an exception, not a propaganda stunt, just duty. Outside the barn, the other women peeked through slats in the wall. They hadn't meant to watch, but they couldn't help it. One covered her mouth. Another clutched her stomach. "Is she dying?" someone asked. No one answered, but they all saw it, how the men moved, how they cleaned their tools, how they worked without bragging or yelling or pointing guns. This was not the America they had been warned about. Midori slept again that afternoon, her fever lowering with each hour. And when she stirred in the evening, the first thing she saw was the doctor writing notes at the table across the room. He didn't look up, didn't need to. He had already done his part. She closed her eyes. And this time, it wasn't from fear. It was because, for the first time in months, she trusted the hands that had touched her. The next morning, a corporal with a clipboard came by the barracks with an offer. The infirmary needed help. Nothing serious, just cleaning instruments, folding gauze, restocking cabinets. Voluntary, he said. No one would be punished for refusing. Midori barely glanced up. Others muttered under their breath. "What do they take us for?" one woman snapped. "Servants?" Another scoffed. "Why should we touch their equipment? They're the ones who claim to be so advanced." Pride was the last thing any of them still owned. But in the hours that followed, the barn kept its quiet rhythm. The nurses moved with precision, the doctors with calm. No shouts, no slaps, just the slow, steady care of a place meant for healing. Midori found herself staring at the door. She wasn't curious, she told herself. She just wanted to see the tray where they kept the scissors, or the cabinet with the surgical thread. That was all. By afternoon, she walked over without a word. The medic on duty was one of the cowboy types, tall, freckled, awkward as a newborn horse. He wore a Red Cross armband like it didn't quite belong, and he had a habit of pushing his hair out of his face every 10 seconds. He saw her at the threshold and offered a grin. "Help?" he said, and pointed to a stack of bandages. She didn't nod, but she stepped forward. The tray was laid out like something from a textbook, rows of instruments lined up by type and size. Each scalpel gleamed. The forceps were spotless. The suture thread was silk-wrapped and labeled. Even the cotton swabs were folded with machine precision. Midori stared. In Nagoya, they had reused scissors without rinsing. Here, there was an entire shelf for sterilization. Her stomach clenched. She reached for a pair of forceps, paused, and then picked them up, light, balanced, untouched by rust. The cowboy leaned over her shoulder and pointed to the bin. "That one clean," he said slowly, his English thick with drawl. Then, hesitating, he added something else. "Key ray. Clean." His Japanese was clumsy, but correct. She looked at him. He smiled, proud of himself, and added, "Bandagy," while motioning toward the gauze. It took her a moment, but then it slipped out a sound she hadn't meant to make. She laughed. It was small, just one breath, but it happened, and she saw him notice. Her face went still again. She turned back to the instruments, cheeks burning with confusion. The irony tasted sharp. She had spent years learning that Americans were violent, lazy, and crude. Now one of them had made her laugh over a tray of sterilized scalpels. They worked in silence after that, occasionally exchanging awkward glances. She refolded the gauze, copying how the American nurse had done it earlier. He swept the floor. When their hands touched over a tin of iodine, they both froze. She pulled away first, but he didn't react. No smirk, no leer, just a nod and a return to sweeping. By evening, she had learned his name, Charlie, and she hated that she remembered it. Later, back in the barracks, the women asked where she'd been. She said nothing. She didn't have the words. How could she explain that she'd just spent 2 hours folding bandages with someone she had been told was less than human? That she'd touched equipment cleaner than anything she'd ever seen in the Empire's finest hospitals? That she'd laughed? Yuri, the most vocal among them, snorted. "Helping the cow doctors now?" Midori didn't respond. But inside, something shifted again. Not a collapse, not yet, but a hairline fracture in the fortress of belief. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. The scream came just after sundown. Short, ragged, ripped straight from the lungs of someone who hadn't expected to survive the night. The barracks door banged open, and 2 guards ran past, hauling a makeshift stretcher between them. The woman on it was limp, except for the spasms in her legs, bare feet twitching like puppet strings had been cut. Her uniform was soaked through with sweat and something darker. Blood, maybe, or pus. The Japanese prisoners gathered at the edge of the compound, drawn by the noise. The sun was bleeding across the sky, casting long shadows that made everything look slower, heavier. Midori stood among them, frozen. She saw the glint of metal in the woman's thigh. Shrapnel. The flesh around it bubbled red and purple. Infection. Deep. Bad. In Nagoya, that woman would have been rolled into a corner, draped with a sheet, and prayed over. Morphine if she was lucky. Silence if she wasn't. But this wasn't Nagoya. The Americans moved fast. The barn doors swung open like stage curtains, and the performance began. Only this wasn't theater. It was something harsher, more precise. The lead medic shouted orders. The younger one fetched saline. Charlie was already prepping a tray with gloved hands. Someone wheeled over a lamp, plugged it into a generator, and light flooded the room. Debridement. Midori realized. They were going to cut. She'd seen it before. But never like this. The woman was stripped to the waist. Her wound laid bare under the harsh light. No screams now, just low, animal groans as the sedative kicked in. An American nurse wiped her brow. Another held her hand. Curtis, the cowboy-turned-corpsman, was already irrigating the wound with long, rhythmic passes of a curved syringe. Saline hissed against torn muscle. Gauze soaked, discarded, replaced. Midori watched from the door, flanked by others. They weren't joking now. No laughter, no snide whispers, just eyes wide and breath held. One of the prisoners, Sachiko, whispered without turning her head, "They're better than our surgeons." No one argued. Because it was true. The irrigation gave way to tweezers, long, curved, glinting in the light. The shrapnel came out in pieces. Midori could see them from where she stood, blackened metal tips, deadly and small, like the claws of something long dead. They placed each fragment into a steel basin. Then came antiseptic, followed by a careful line of stitches, each one pulled tight and knotted with elegance that reminded Midori of embroidery. The woman's leg was wrapped, her pulse checked again, and within minutes her breathing had calmed. Someone placed a fresh sheet over her. A nurse dabbed her forehead and murmured something soothing. The fan hummed above, steady as a heartbeat. Midori blinked. This wasn't backwoods guessing. This was science, discipline, not luck, not whiskey, not whispered prayers and bamboo splints. It was the kind of medicine they had been told the Americans couldn't possibly know. But here it was in front of them, saving lives without fanfare. The crowd at the door thinned slowly, as if retreating from something sacred. But Midori didn't move. Her feet were rooted, not in fear, in awe. Back in the barracks, no one spoke. The air was too full of questions they didn't know how to ask. Even Yuri, the one who always had something to say, kept her eyes low. They had all seen it. The truth was undeniable now. Respect had crept in, silent and unwelcome. Not the kind born from kindness or charm, the kind born from skill. And skill, real skill, demanded something none of them had prepared to give the enemy. Recognition. It clung to her, long after she left the barn. It wasn't just what she had seen, it was what she had felt. A quiet unraveling inside her, something ancient loosening its grip. Midori walked back to the barracks with a small bundle under her arm. The nurse had insisted she take the pillow with her. "Clean," he'd said, pressing it into her hands with a smile. "Lavender soap. Helps sleep." She hadn't argued. Back in the dim barracks, the others watched her enter without a word. She didn't meet their eyes, just walked to her cot, sat down, and placed the pillow against the wall like it was something fragile. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, she lay down. The pillow was soft. Not like the straw-stuffed sacks they'd had on the ship, or the lice-ridden cloths back in Nagoya. This one held its shape, cradled the head, and carried a faint, unfamiliar scent. Lavender? Yes, but more than that. It smelled like safety, like someone had washed it not out of duty, but out of care. She turned her face into it, and for the first time in over 2 years, she didn't sleep with her hand curled around a hidden blade. The war didn't end in her dreams, but it changed. She didn't see blood-drenched uniforms or hear the howls of amputees. Instead, she saw a man stitching a wound with gentle precision. She saw a woman with a clipboard writing careful notes. She saw the cowboy again, Curtis, holding someone steady as they vomited from fever. The people in her dreams weren't soldiers. They were survivors, healers, and for once, so was she. She woke with tear tracks on her face and the pillow still warm beneath her cheek. Later, when the guards came for roll call, Midori tucked the pillow under her arm again, unwilling to leave it behind. It wasn't about softness, it was about proof. Proof that something had shifted, however small. The linens at the infirmary hadn't just comforted her body. They'd scraped at her beliefs. They had whispered a question she didn't want to answer. What if the enemy had known more about mercy than she ever did? The contradiction gnawed at her. Cruelty would have been easier. She was ready for beatings, starvation, humiliation. She had built armor for that. But gentleness? That was the real weapon. It slid past defenses like smoke, filled the spaces between doubt and memory, and made you ache in ways pain never could. Midori didn't know how to fight it. She wasn't sure she wanted to. At lunchtime, she sat apart from the others, pillow beside her. Yuri caught her eye, then looked away. The silence between them was growing. Once, Midori would have felt shame. Now she felt something else. Distance. That evening, a Red Cross nurse passed by with a basket of laundry. Midori watched her walk, hips steady, head high, like someone who had never known the fear of being invisible. She thought of the infirmary shelves, the precise order of the tools, the smell of antiseptic instead of mildew, the absence of flies, the charts, the pencils, the clean water. She imagined what it might feel like to wear white again, not as surrender, but as purpose. The thought startled her. She almost stood, almost said something, but instead she looked down at her hands. They were calloused, cracked, but not broken. Not anymore. She placed the pillow in her lap and pressed her fingers against the fabric, feeling the soap smell rise like a ghost. Healing, she realized, wasn't just something you received. It was something you carried forward. Something you decided to believe in, even when it came from the enemy. The laughter stopped 3 days later. It happened just after dawn, when the fog still clung to the ground like a second skin. The women were lining up for breakfast when Yuri suddenly doubled over. At first, everyone thought she was laughing again, her usual sharp bark of humor that cut through fear like a blade. But then the sound changed. It broke into something wet, strangled. She dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, and a dark stain bloomed against her sleeve. For a moment, no one moved. Yuri had always been the loudest, the sharpest, the one who mocked the Americans the hardest, who scoffed at their clean floors and gentle hands. She was the one who called them farm boys playing doctor, who laughed loudest when the women whispered about kindness. Now she was on the ground, gasping, her face pale and wet with sweat. "Get up," someone whispered. "Stop it." But Yuri couldn't. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she folded in on herself like paper soaked in rain. Midori was the first to move. She crossed the distance without thinking, dropping to her knees beside her friend. "Yuri," she whispered, gripping her shoulders. "Look at me." The woman's eyes fluttered, unfocused. Blood spotted her lips. Panic surged through Midori's chest, sharp and hot. She shouted for help, her voice breaking the stillness like glass. The guards came running. So did the medic. The moment he saw the blood, his expression changed. Gone was the casual calm. In its place came precision, purpose. Orders were barked, swift and clear. Someone fetched the stretcher. Another fetched water. The barn came alive again, not with chaos, but with coordination. Yuri tried to wave them away. "I'm fine," she rasped, stubborn even now. "Just tired." But her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled again, and this time she didn't fight the hands that lifted her. Midori followed them, heart hammering, fear crawling up her throat. She had seen this before, in the hospital back home, the way someone looked when their body was losing a battle. She wanted to scream. She wanted to beg. Instead, she found herself saying the words she had never believed she would say. "Please," she whispered to the American doctor. "Help her." He didn't answer. He was already working. The room filled with motion boots, voices, the clink of metal. A cot was rolled in. Sleeves were rolled up. The doctor listened to Yuri's chest, his brow furrowing. The nurse beside him prepped instruments with quick, practiced movements. Someone pressed a cloth to Yuri's mouth as she coughed again, crimson blooming against white. Midori stood frozen, her nails biting into her palms. This was the moment she had been warned about. This was when the enemy would turn cruel, when the mask would drop. It didn't. They worked with a focus that bordered on reverence. The doctor spoke in low tones, his words clipped but calm. "She's septic," he said. "We can still help her." The nurse nodded, already preparing medication. The room smelled of alcohol and iron and something sharp that burned the back of Midori's throat. But beneath it all was something else: control. Hours passed like heartbeats. The sun climbed higher. Sweat soaked collars and sleeves. Finally, the fever broke. Yuri's breathing slowed. The red stain on the cloth stopped spreading. Midori sagged against the wall, her legs barely holding her. When the doctor finally straightened, exhaustion etched into his face, he looked at her and said quietly, "She's stable." The word hit her harder than any blow. Stable. She had never heard it used like that, not as a promise, but as a fact. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, pressing her forehead to the cool boards. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The emotion was too large, too unfamiliar. Later, when Yuri slept, her color returning in faint shades, Midori sat beside her. The bravado was gone from her friend's face. In its place was something small and vulnerable, human. "You should have let me die," Yuri murmured weakly. Midori shook her head. "No." "Why not?" Her voice was hoarse. "We were taught." "I know," Midori said softly. "But they didn't." Yuri turned her head, eyes glassy. "Then everything we were taught was wrong." Midori didn't answer. "She didn't need to." The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of breathing, and in that silence something old finally broke. The armor they had worn since childhood cracked, not with violence, but with truth. The enemy had not destroyed them. They had saved them. And in that moment, as the sun crept higher and light spilled across the floor, Midori understood something that would change her forever. Survival was not betrayal. It was permission to live. The word slipped out by accident the first time. A soft murmur, barely more than breath. "Sensei." It drifted across the infirmary like a leaf, unnoticed at first. The woman who said it froze the moment the sound left her mouth, eyes widening as if she had uttered something forbidden. The American medic didn't react. He was busy adjusting a bandage, his focus absolute. But the word lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Sensei. Teacher. Master. Guide. In another life, it would have been unthinkable to use it for a foreigner, especially one in uniform. Yet the word had slipped out naturally, without intention, as if her mind had already accepted what her pride still resisted. It began to happen more often after that. The women stopped whispering insults when the medics passed. Instead, they began to watch, to notice. They noticed how the Americans washed their hands between patients, how they changed gloves, how they labeled jars and folded gauze with ritual precision. They noticed how questions were asked, not barked, and how answers were explained, even when language failed and gestures had to stand in for words. The more they watched, the more something shifted. One afternoon, Midori approached the supply table hesitantly, clutching a stack of freshly laundered linens. The nurse on duty smiled and motioned for her to set them down. Midori lingered, eyes scanning the shelves, the instruments, the careful order of it all. Then she pointed at a small metal box with a hinged lid and said, in halting English, "What for?" The nurse paused, surprised, then answered slowly, showing her the contents: gauze, sutures, a vial of antiseptic. She demonstrated how each was used. Midori listened with fierce concentration, nodding as though absorbing a lesson she had waited years to learn. When the nurse finished, Midori bowed not deeply, but sincerely. "Sensei," she said again. The nurse laughed softly, embarrassed, but the word stuck. Soon others used it too, at first jokingly, then without irony. It wasn't submission, it was recognition, and with recognition came curiosity. The women began to ask questions. How did you stop infection? Why did the fever go down? What was inside the needle? They leaned close as procedures were explained, mimicking hand movements in the air, tracing invisible diagrams with their fingers. The infirmary became a classroom, and learning replaced fear as the dominant rhythm of the room. One afternoon, Midori asked to hold a textbook. It was old and dog-eared, its pages smelling faintly of disinfectant. She turned it slowly, tracing the diagrams of bones and organs as if they were maps to a forgotten country. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with longing. This was knowledge denied to her, locked behind walls of tradition and hierarchy. And now it sat in her hands, unguarded. She thought of her training back home, the way questions were discouraged, how obedience was prized over understanding, how knowledge was rationed like food. Here, the opposite seemed true. The more one asked, the more was given. At night, the women spoke quietly among themselves, not of escape, not of revenge, but of anatomy, of how infections spread, of why clean water mattered, of how many lives might have been saved if these things had been known sooner. The conversations were hushed, almost reverent. It was terrifying, because it meant admitting something unthinkable, that the enemy had something worth learning. And if that was true, then what else had they been wrong about? The realization sat heavy in their chests. It made sleep uneasy. It made memory ache. It made the past feel less certain, and the future strangely open. To learn was to change, and change meant leaving parts of themselves behind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised purples and golds, Midori watched the medics clean up after another long shift. She saw the care with which they wiped instruments, the way they checked and rechecked supplies. There was no cruelty in their efficiency, only commitment. She thought of the word again. Sensei. Not a title of submission, but of respect, earned. The realization settled quietly inside her, heavy and undeniable. The war had taken many things from her home, certainty, innocence, but it had not taken her capacity to learn. And in that understanding, something inside her shifted forever. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The war had taken many things from her home, certainty, innocence, but it had not taken her capacity to learn. The pen hovered over the paper like a blade. Midori's hand trembled, not from fever or weakness this time, but from something deeper, uncertainty. The lined stationery felt foreign beneath her fingers, its edges too straight, its surface too clean. She hadn't written in months, not truly, not honestly. But now, with the censors permitting outbound mail, the weight of truth pressed down like a stone. She glanced around the barracks. The others were writing too, some carefully copying rehearsed phrases, others sketching drawings of imagined peace. Midori's page was still mostly blank. She wrote her name in kanji, hesitated, then began slowly, each stroke deliberate. They cured an infection I would have died from. She stared at the sentence. It pulsed on the page like an open wound. She could stop there, tear it up, say something safer, that the food was edible, that the work was tolerable, that the Americans were strange but manageable. But her hand stayed still. The ink dried. The words had already landed. She set the pen down and rubbed her forehead. It felt like confession, like rebellion, like betrayal, because that sentence wasn't just a report, it was an admission. And to admit that she had been saved by the enemy was to question everything that came before. Outside, the wind rustled the canvas of the tents. Somewhere, a medic called out instructions. A woman coughed. Midori looked down at her hands, the same hands that once washed the dying in Nagoya, who folded the clothes of girls too thin to stand. Those hands had held scalpels and blood. Now they held a pen. She picked it up again. They are not what we were told. The second sentence cut deeper. She waited for shame, but what came instead was clarity, like a fever breaking, like breath returning. She thought of Yuri, still recovering, her once sharp voice now quieter, more thoughtful. She thought of the textbook with its careful diagrams, of Curtis, the cowboy-turned-medic who offered her aspirin with a lopsided grin, of the pillow that smelled like lavender, of the way the Americans said, "Please," and "You're welcome," even when they didn't need to. Midori had seen cruelty. She had worked beside it, watched it walk the halls of the Nagoya hospital in stiff uniforms and barked commands. She had seen mercy treated as weakness, science twisted into obedience. And now, in this strange patch of Texas dirt, surrounded by barbed wire, she was learning something new. That kindness, too, could be a form of discipline. That compassion required more strength than brutality. That medicine, real medicine, was not about pride or flags, but about saving lives. She continued writing, not quickly, but steadily. She didn't describe everything. There were things she couldn't say, words she didn't have. But she told the truth in the only way she could. They treat us with care. They clean their tools. They speak gently. I don't understand it, but I think they mean it. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in the bin. Somewhere it would be opened by a censor. Somewhere in Tokyo, a man in uniform would read it. His eyes might narrow. His fingers might tighten. He might underline a sentence, mark it for silence. But it would be read, and that was enough. Because once truth leaves the mouth or the page, it cannot be unwritten. It lingers. It plants questions in the soil of certainty. And even if no answer follows, the seed is there. Midori sat back, breathing deeply. The diagnosis had been made. And this time, it wasn't for a body, but a belief. The sea stretched out before her, wide and gray, its surface broken only by the slow churn of the ship carrying them home. Midori stood near the rail, coat buttoned tight, the Texas sun now just a distant ghost on her skin. Around her, other former prisoners murmured softly or stood in silence. Some cried, others stared ahead, unmoving. The wind carried the scent of salt and rust. She didn't wave goodbye. Not because she didn't want to, but because the people she was leaving behind weren't watching. And maybe it was better that way. Clean breaks. No ceremony. Just a quiet closing of a chapter that had rewritten everything. In her bag, tucked beneath a folded uniform and a bar of soap she couldn't bring herself to use, was a small medical manual. American. Laminated cover. Dog-eared pages. And inside it, a note. It was written in simple English. Stay well. You were braver than you know. C. Monroe. She hadn't known his first name until then. Just Curtis. The cowboy with calloused hands and a voice like gravel. He had once held her wrist during a fever check so gently she thought her bones might dissolve. And now, he had sent her away with a gift no one could censor, a reminder that not all wounds left scars. Midori ran her fingers across the edge of the manual, then let her hand fall to her side. They called them doctors, she whispered, the words carried off by wind. And me, alive. The others had started to say it too, toward the end. Not cowboys, not medics, not jailers, doctors. It came first with hesitation, then with reluctant respect. In the last weeks, no one laughed when they said it. They said it with weight, because they'd seen hands that healed without cruelty, eyes that saw pain and chose to ease it. That wasn't weakness. That was power of a kind no battlefield could touch. Her body was different now. She could feel it, muscle where there had once been bone, color in her cheeks that hadn't existed since before the hunger months. Her back no longer ached with every breath. She could walk across the deck without stumbling. Even the nurses on the ship had commented, "You look strong," one had said. Midori had nodded, not answering. The strength came from more than food. It came from survival, yes, but also from having seen the world crack open and show something unexpected. There had been no propaganda for this. No training had prepared her for the complexity of gratitude. It wasn't clean. It didn't fit into boxes. It sat in the chest like a second heart, beating with contradiction. She hated the war. But she couldn't hate the men who had saved her. She missed home. But part of her would always remember the lavender pillow. She believed in her country. But now, she also believed in antiseptic and scalpel edges and men who said, "I'm sorry," before cutting into skin. Back in Tokyo, when the ship docked, no parade waited, just gray streets, ration lines, and a silence that swallowed voices. Midori stepped off the gangplank, the manual hidden deep in her coat. She walked forward, past the uniformed officers, past the men with clipboards and blank expressions. No one asked her what she had seen. No one wanted to know. But she carried it anyway. In the months to come, she would speak little. She would find work as a nurse. She would teach herself English in quiet corners of borrowed libraries. She would volunteer at a clinic that used recycled American equipment. And one day, when a little boy arrived with a fever and no family, she would sit beside him and say gently, in perfect English, "You're safe now." She would never forget the barbed wire, or the hunger, or the sound of boots in gravel. But she would also never forget the men who folded gauze with steady hands, who sterilized needles without cruelty, who held life as something worth fighting for, even when it wore the face of the enemy. They had been her captors. They had also been her doctors. And she had been a prisoner. But now, she was alive. If this story moved you, please like the video and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered.